Otis had lost an eye. He didn't remember when he'd last had it, but it had been hanging by a thread for a while. Then one morning when he woke up, he had only one eye to open. It was odd. He had to turn right round to see what was on the side where his other eye used to be. Rosa noticed it when she came home from school. She looked in the bed and under the pillow. She looked under the bed and all around the room, even in the bin. She lifted the carpet and found 2 coins, a sock that matched the one her mother had just made into a hand puppet, and a startled woodlouse which scuttled off down a crack in the floorboards. But Otis's eye was nowhere to be seen. As Rosa searched, Otis looked on with his one remaining eye. It was a proper bear's eye, brown and glassy, with a black pupil in the middle. Eventually, Rosa gave up and went to ask her mother if perhaps she had a spare eye. Well, her mother didn't think there were any spare eyes, but there might be something in the button and bead basket they could use instead. The basket was made from crocheted seagrass with a little crocheted button to hold it shut, and it had first belonged to Rosa's mother's mother's mother. It was full of treasures and memories. Whenever a piece of clothing was too worn out to be mended or sent to the charity shop, then the buttons were snipped off and put in the basket. If a necklace broke and the beads went pinging and bouncing all over the place, then they were collected up and popped into the basket too. This had been going on for almost 100 years, so the basket was quite full. Rosa took Otis and the basket out into the garden and set them down on a blanket on the lawn. She rummaged through the buttons and beads, turning them over and inspecting each one carefully. They were all shapes and sizes and every colour and hue. There were lots of buttons made from plastic. Shirt buttons, coat buttons, cardigan buttons with animals and clowns' faces in the shape of boats and stars and strawberries. There were plain flat buttons and there were domed fabric-covered buttons from ladies' dresses and jackets. There were metal buttons, some from Rosa's great-granddad's Air Force greatcoat. There were buttons made from mother of pearl, from great big ones like an oyster shell, right down to teeny weeny ones for babies' dresses. And there were even some funny little black buttons held together with a piece of thread that Mummy said came from a pair of shoes back in a time when you needed a special hook to do them up. Rosa held them up one by one for Otis to see. Otis looked with his good eye and his head on one side. Some of the buttons looked like fun, but he couldn't imagine you could see very well through them. Rosa turned her attention to the beads. There were plastic beads, glass beads with little swirly flowers inside and another coloured glass, and there were beads that Rosa had made at school for Mother's Day, winding strips of pictures cut from magazines and soaked in glue round and round a pencil. Otis admired these very much and thought that Rosa was very clever, but he didn't think they'd be very good for looking through. Then there were pottery beads from different parts of the world. Rosa found one from China. It was cream with Chinese characters written on it in blue. She held it in the place where Otis's other eye had been. Now the funny thing was, he didn't see Rosa through it. All of a sudden, Otis could see a garden filled with blue plum trees in blossom, an ornamental pond full of blue fish, and in the distance, a blue girl in a long blue cheongsam leaning over a little blue bridge. All the while, the tiny blue characters scrolled up in front of the scene as the story unfolded. It was all very pretty, but Otis thought he might get fed up with seeing everything blue, and besides, Rosa hadn't taught him to read and write Chinese yet. He could barely write his own name. Well, he could write his name barely, which meant just dipping a paw into mud or chocolate spread or something similar and making a print. He shook his head and Rosa dropped the bead back into the basket. Then she found a yellow and black striped bead from Africa. She held it up to Otis's face to try. Now Otis could see a wide grassy plain with animals grazing peacefully under the hot sun. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a pack of fierce dog-like animals appeared and started to chase the grazing animals. Well, it was all very exciting, but rather alarming, and Otis didn't really want to see what happened when the animals doing the chasing caught up with the ones being chased. No, that wouldn't do. And the next thing Rosa found was a toggle from someone's old duffel coat. No, Otis didn't even want to try that. It was the wrong shape anyway. What's more, it was made from horn, so it had actually belonged to someone else before who must have been very attached to it, and he had an idea that they hadn't said they didn't want it any longer. Rosa rummaged around some more, then looked up and held out her hand for Otis to see what she had found. It was an acorn. "What about this?" she asked. "It's about the right size and it's brown." Otis looked at the acorn with his one bear's eye and shrugged. Rosa held it in place for him. Otis looked back at her with his one bear's eye and his new acorn eye. What he could see now was lots of leaves and a patch of blue sky with clouds in it. He started to feel giddy because what the acorn eye was seeing was evidently a long way off the ground. A bee whirred past with bulging pollen sacs. "Bzzy, bzzy, bzzy, no time to stop," it buzzed. Then a couple of birds flew by. One landed on Otis's branch, making it jump up and down. And with the other eye he could still see Rosa, who was sitting quite still. He tried not to look with his bear's eye and only see through the acorn eye. Now there was a red squirrel. It was leaning up really close and reaching out with its little paw. Otis drew his head back in surprise. The squirrel gave a start and hurriedly moved away. Otis looked at Rosa and shook his head. No, that wasn't going to work either. So what now? Had to find something else. In the meantime, Rosa had found an old marble that had belonged to her granddad. A blood alley with veins of red through the white marble. Otis was impressed. A horror eye. He could scare all the snooty dolls with that. Rosa held it in place for him, but as soon as Otis looked through it, he saw another marble coming straight at him, an Aggie. He blinked, just as it hit with a smack. No, thank you. With an eye like that, he'd lose his own marbles in no time. Now, near the bottom of the basket, there were some eyes. A little packet of self-adhesive goggly eyes. Otis didn't much like the idea. He thought he would look silly. But Rosa laughed and said they could just try one out. So she took an eye out of the packet, peeled off the backing and stuck it to Otis's face. It was very small, and when Rosa picked him up and shook him gently, the whole world seemed to go round and round, and Otis thought he might be sick. Rosa took the eye off again. He was right. It did look silly. Well, what about that? Rosa saw that Otis was looking at a hagstone. Now, a hagstone is a stone that's been rolling around on the seabed until the water and sand have worn a hole right through it. It has magical properties. This one still had a bit of string attached where someone had been wearing it round their neck. Rosa held it up for Otis to look through, and there, on the other side, he could see a seashore. There were gulls wheeling overhead in a muscle grey sky, and an orange sun was setting behind the dunes. All along the shore, Otis could see white horses, and mounted on their backs were strange folk, tall and slender with long fair hair and all dressed in green. They were riding to meet the white horses of the tide, which was coming in fast. As Otis looked, he saw the water rise over his stone, and in an instant he was being swirled away over the sand, colliding with other pebbles and shells, and out to sea, while the horses' hooves pounded around him and churned the water into foam. Otis gasped, and Rosa took the stone away and put it back in the basket. Then right at the bottom of the box, Rosa spotted something shiny. It was a wonderful crystal bead. It was multifaceted like a diamond, and Rosa thought it would give Otis a rather swish look, something between bling and steampunk. Otis wasn't sure, but it seemed to be the last resort for the moment. He sat patiently while Rosa took a needle and some button thread and sewed the bead into the place where his lost eye used to be. She did it very carefully so as not to hurt Otis, and Otis kept very still while she was doing it so as not to disturb Rosa, who had her tongue between her teeth and might bite it if he said, "Ow!" Once the crystal bead was in place, Otis tried looking through it. It didn't work like the other eye, and it didn't work like the other beads or buttons. What Otis could see now was lots of small versions of what he could see with his good eye. Some of the images were the right way up and some of them were upside down. When Rosa put her face up close to his, Otis could see it many times over, upside down and the right way up, and all very small. It was rather confusing. The sun was shining brightly and Otis could see the sunbeams splitting up into lots of little pieces of colour, red, yellow, blue, a bit like a kaleidoscope and a bit like a rainbow. Rosa set Otis back down on the blanket while she went on looking in the basket. He watched a ladybird climbing up a dandelion stalk. The ladybird looked back at him. Lots of ladybirds looked back at him, all tiny, some of them the right way up and some of them upside down, and all waving their antennae at him. Then the ladybird reached the top of the dandelion and flew away, and Otis watched the ones flying upside down with interest. It was quite fascinating. Now Otis wasn't sure which was better, one bear's eye and the crystal bead, or just the bear's eye. Well, he could always choose to close one or the other when he wanted to change the way he saw the world, but right now he was feeling a bit tired with all this looking. Rosa said she had a pirate's eye patch on a piece of elastic that he could borrow. At supper, when the family was seated around the table, Rosa's mother saw Otis in his eye patch and said that he looked very dashing and distinguished. Guess what I found in the tumble dryer, though? I kept hearing a tink, tink, tink kind of noise. Here! And out of her pocket she fetched something small and brown and shiny. It was Otis's lost eye. I'll sew it back on for him after dinner, she promised. Otis breathed a sigh of relief. It had all been very interesting, but he thought that what he would like best was to have two bear's eyes again.